The morning sun had just broken through the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the quiet roadside diner that sat like a forgotten postcard along Highway 52. Steam rose from coffee cups clutched in weathered hands, curling lazily into the crisp autumn air. The low rumble of powerful engines filled the parking lot, a symphony of chrome and horsepower that announced the presence of men who lived by their own code. The smell of fuel mixed with bacon grease and worn leather hung thick around the group of Hell's Angels bikers who had stopped for breakfast, their motorcycles lined up like soldiers at attention. They looked tough, the kind of men people crossed the street to avoid. Tattooed arms, scarred knuckles, eyes that had seen too much and said too little. Their vests bore patches earned through loyalty and time, symbols that spoke of brotherhood forged in fire. But beneath those intimidating exteriors, beneath the ink and the leather and the carefully cultivated reputation, they carried stories no one ever asked about. Stories of loss and redemption, of families left behind and second chances never given. The laughter between them echoed against the chrome of their motorcycles. Rough and genuine, the kind of camaraderie that can't be faked or bought. Then, without warning, a piercing, desperate cry shattered everything. It cut through the morning like a knife through silk, so raw and terrified that every head turned in unison. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the engines seemed to quiet, as if the machines themselves sensed something terrible was unfolding. A tiny figure in a red dress came running across the parking lot, her small boots slipping slightly on the cold pavement still wet with morning dew. Her messy light brown hair flew behind her like a flag of distress, and her face was streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes wild with panic. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, this little girl running toward a group of men that most adults would fear. But fear of strangers meant nothing compared to what she was running from. Her voice cracked with terror as she screamed, her small arm outstretched, finger pointing desperately back toward the road. "Please." The word came out broken, strangled by sobs. "They're hurting my mama. Please, somebody help her." The group froze. Time seemed to stop in that parking lot. The sound of her sobs was so raw, so utterly genuine, that even the idling engines seemed to fall silent out of respect for her pain. A couple of truckers near the gas pumps turned their heads, their expressions torn between concern and the modern instinct to stay uninvolved, to not get mixed up in other people's problems. Someone pulled out a phone, probably to call the police, but no one moved. No one stepped forward. No one except one man. Mason Cole had been leaning against his Harley, enjoying the rare moment of peace before the day's ride. He was a broad-shouldered biker in his late 30s, his jacket stitched with the red and white emblem of the Hell's Angels, a patch he'd worn proudly for over a decade. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by a scar that ran along his jawline, a souvenir from a fight he rarely talked about. He'd seen a lot in life, fights in parking lots and bar rooms, betrayals by people he'd called friends, blood on his hands and on his conscience. He'd made mistakes, served time, rebuilt himself from nothing more than anger and determination. But never in all those hard years had he seen a child like this. Never had he heard such pure, unfiltered desperation. Without thinking, operating on instinct older than any code written in club bylaws, Mason dropped to one knee in front of the little girl. His large, calloused hands gently steadied her trembling shoulders, and he looked directly into her terrified eyes. "Where's your mama?" he asked softly, though his voice still carried that gravelly weight like stones tumbling in a river. The little girl could barely speak through her tears. Her whole body was shaking, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But she pointed again, her small finger unwavering down the two-lane road toward a cluster of old trailers half hidden by a stand of scraggly pine trees about a quarter-mile away. "They're beating her," she sobbed, the words spilling out between gasps. "He's going to kill her. Please, please help her." Mason's jaw tightened. His eyes, which had been soft with concern, turned hard as flint. He'd heard enough. He'd seen enough domestic situations go bad in his life to know that every second counted. That hesitation could mean the difference between saving a life and attending a funeral. Without a second thought, Mason rose to his feet, his entire demeanor shifting from gentle protector to something far more dangerous. "Tank rider with me," he said, his voice cutting through the morning air like a command from a general. He motioned to two of his brothers, men he'd ridden with for years, men he trusted with his life. Tank was a mountain of a man, 6'4" and built like a linebacker, with hands that could crush a beer can without effort. Ryder was leaner but no less intimidating, with eyes that never stopped moving, always watching, always ready. Both men understood immediately. This wasn't a request. This was a call to action. The three men swung their legs over their Harleys in one fluid motion, years of practice making the movement look effortless. Engines roared to life with a thunder that shook the ground, tires screeching as they tore down the road, leaving black marks on the pavement. Dust and wind kicked up around the diner, swirling in their wake, leaving everyone else standing in stunned silence, mouths open, still processing what had just happened. The little girl, still shaking violently from fear and adrenaline, was gently taken inside by one of the other bikers, a man called Preacher, who'd gotten his nickname for the calm way he talked people down from bad decisions. He wrapped her carefully in his leather jacket, the garment swallowing her tiny frame, and guided her to a booth by the window. She sat there, eyes wide as saucers, watching as the red taillights of the motorcycles disappeared in the distance, three guardian angels racing toward violence. The road stretched quiet for almost 5 minutes. Inside the diner, no one spoke. The waitress stood frozen with a coffee pot in her hand. Other patrons had stopped eating, forks suspended in midair. Everyone was waiting, listening, wondering what was happening down that lonely stretch of road. Then, faintly at first, the sound of chaos drifted back across the distance. Angry shouting, a woman's cry of pain and fear, and the roar of engines cutting through violence like the wrath of God himself. Mason and his crew had found the trailer, and what they saw when they kicked through that flimsy door burned into their memories forever, images they'd carry for the rest of their lives. Inside the cramped, dark space that smelled of stale beer and desperation, a man had cornered a woman against the wall. He was drunk, his movements uncoordinated but no less dangerous for it, his face twisted with rage that seemed to have no source, no reason beyond its own existence. His fists were already bloodied, his voice slurred with alcohol and fury, screaming accusations that made no sense, lost in his own nightmare of violence. The woman was trapped, backed against the peeling wallpaper with nowhere to go. The small cracked window let in only a sliver of sunlight that fell cruelly across her terrified face, illuminating every bruise, every mark of violence that decorated her skin like a map of suffering. Her eye was swollen nearly shut, her lips split and bleeding, her hands raised in a futile attempt to protect herself from the next blow. The man raised his fist again, a bottle clutched in his other hand like a weapon, and the woman closed her eyes, waiting for impact that seemed inevitable. But before he could strike again, the sound of heavy boots hit the floorboards with the weight of judgment itself. Mason moved faster than a man his size should be able to move. He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed the man's wrist mid-swing, his grip like iron fingers digging into flesh and bone. He twisted hard, using leverage and rage in equal measure, forcing the man to drop the bottle he'd been clutching. It shattered on the floor, glass and cheap whiskey spreading across the stained linoleum, the sound seeming to echo in the sudden silence. Tank and Ryder were right behind him. They pinned the man down effortlessly, their combined weight and experience making resistance impossible. The man struggled, screaming obscenities, making threats that meant nothing to men who'd heard worse and done worse in their own pasts. But his struggling was futile. Within seconds, he was face down on the floor, arms behind his back, going nowhere. No words were needed. No speeches about right and wrong. Just action, swift and decisive. Mason turned away from the subdued attacker and focused on the woman, his expression softening instantly, all the hardness melting away to reveal the compassion underneath. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly with controlled anger, with the effort it took not to turn around and finish what the drunk had started. The woman, Carla, nodded weakly, though it was clear she was anything but okay. Tears spilled down her bruised cheeks, mixing with blood from her split lip. Her hands shook uncontrollably, shock beginning to set in now that the immediate danger had passed. She tried to speak, to thank them, to explain, but no words would come, only tears, relief and terror and disbelief all mixed together. Outside, barely audible at first but growing louder, the sound of police sirens began to echo faintly in the distance. A neighbor must have called it in finally after who knows how long this had been going on. Better late than never, Mason thought bitterly, though he was grateful they were coming at all. When the cops arrived, lights flashing and radios crackling, they found a scene they probably hadn't expected. The bikers didn't run. They didn't try to disappear into the woods or make excuses. They simply stood in the overgrown yard, hands raised in a non-threatening manner, calm and steady. The little girl was clinging to Mason's leg, her small fingers gripping the denim of his jeans like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned upside down. The police officers, two young deputies who probably hadn't been on the force more than a few years, approached cautiously, hands near their weapons, not sure what they were walking into. But Carla, summoning strength from somewhere deep inside, stepped forward to explain everything. Her voice was hoarse from screaming, from crying, from years of keeping silent, but now the words poured out. She told them about her ex-boyfriend, freshly released from jail after serving 18 months for assault. She told them how he'd tracked her down that morning, showing up at her door before sunrise, drunk and angry, demanding to be let back into her life. She told them how it had escalated, how she'd tried to get him to leave, how he'd forced his way inside, how little Hannah had managed to slip out the back door and run for help while her mother screamed for her to go. To run, to find someone, anyone. She told them how these bikers, these men that society had written off as criminals and troublemakers, had responded without hesitation when everyone else had looked the other way. When the police finally led the man away in handcuffs, still screaming threats and curses, Mason quietly walked the little girl, Hannah, back to his motorcycle. She was calmer now, the immediate terror replaced by exhaustion and the kind of trust that only children can give so completely. "You did good, kid," Mason said softly, crouching down to her level one more time. "You were brave. You saved your mama's life today. You know that?" Hannah nodded, her eyes red from crying but clear now, focused. "Are you a good guy?" she asked, the question so innocent and direct that it caught Mason off guard. He paused, thinking about his past, about all the mistakes and the violence and the time spent in places he'd rather forget. "I'm trying to be," he finally said. "That's all any of us can do. Just try." They rode back to the diner together, Hannah sitting on his lap in front of him, clutching a helmet far too big for her small head. Mason drove slowly, carefully aware of his precious cargo. The morning sun had now risen fully above the horizon, burning away the last of the fog, turning the world gold and green and impossibly beautiful. Hannah pointed at birds flying overhead, at flowers growing wild along the roadside, at everything and nothing, her child's mind already beginning to process and file away the trauma, to find normal in the aftermath of horror. By the time they returned to the diner, a small crowd had gathered outside. Truckers, travelers, locals who'd heard something was happening, all waiting anxiously to see what had happened, to know if the little girl was safe, if the woman had survived. When they saw Mason pulling in slowly with Hannah on his lap, her mother walking slowly behind them on Ryder's bike, bruised but alive, every conversation stopped. The world seemed to go silent for a moment, as if no one wanted to break the spell, as if speaking might shatter this fragile moment of grace. Carla climbed off the motorcycle carefully, moving like every part of her body hurt, which it probably did, but she was standing. She was breathing. She was alive. Hannah ran to her immediately, wrapping her small arms around her mother's legs, and Carla collapsed to her knees, pulling her daughter close. Sobbing with relief and pain and gratitude, her voice shaking, barely above a whisper but heard by everyone in that silent parking lot, Carla thanked the bikers over and over. "I didn't think anyone would come," she whispered, the words breaking in the middle. I thought this was how it would end." Mason looked at her. This broken woman who'd found the strength to survive, and simply said, "She made sure we did." He nodded toward Hannah, whose cheeks were still flushed from crying but now carried the faintest hint of relief, of safety, of a childhood that might still be salvaged. The diner's owner, a heavyset woman named Betty who'd been serving coffee and pie at this spot for 30 years, came out with blankets and coffee, offering them quietly, her eyes wet with tears she didn't bother to hide. She'd seen a lot over the years, but nothing quite like this. Nothing that had reminded her so powerfully that people could still surprise you, could still be better than you expected, one by one, without speaking, without making a show of it. The Hell's Angels removed their jackets and draped them around Carla and Hannah. It was a gesture so unexpected, so tender from men who looked like they'd crush you for looking at them wrong, that even the police officers, still lingering by their cars filling out paperwork, looked away in quiet respect. Some moments were too sacred to observe too closely. The patch on Mason's vest caught the morning light as he leaned down one more time to speak to Hannah. The girl looked up at him with complete trust, the kind of faith that children give so easily and adults guard so jealously. "You take care of your mama now, all right?" he said, his rough voice gentle. "You're her little guardian angel." Hannah nodded solemnly, understanding in some deep way that this moment mattered, that something important had happened here. Her small fingers gripped the edge of his sleeve, not wanting to let go of this anchor of safety. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "Yeah, kid," Mason said, surprising himself with the promise. "Yeah, you will." News of what happened spread fast, the way stories do in small towns where everyone knows everyone and gossip travels faster than the internet. By lunchtime, half the town had heard the story of the little girl who ran to the bikers and how the Hells Angels didn't hesitate. Didn't think twice, didn't do what was smart or safe or legal, but what was right. Strangers stopped by the diner throughout the day just to shake their hands, to thank them for stepping in when others froze. Old ladies brought homemade cookies. Veterans came by to buy them lunch. Even the town's pastor showed up, talking about good Samaritans and how God worked through unexpected vessels. Mason wasn't a man of many words, never had been. He let his actions speak for him, always had. But when someone asked why they'd done it, why they'd risked themselves for people they didn't know, he simply said, "You don't ignore a cry like that. Doesn't matter what patch you wear, some things are just human." It was that simple and that complicated all at once. Over the next few weeks, Carla and Hannah started the long, difficult process of rebuilding their lives from the ruins. The local community, galvanized by what had happened, pitched in with the kind of generosity that restores your faith in humanity. People offered furniture from their garages and attics. Churches brought groceries. The local women's shelter helped Carla navigate the legal system, getting a restraining order, filing charges, doing all the paperwork that comes with escaping abuse. Someone even offered them a small apartment in town, above a hardware store, nothing fancy but clean and safe and theirs. And every Sunday, without fail, a group of bikers could be seen parked outside the diner. They'd check in on Carla and Hannah, bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting quietly at the diner table with a cup of coffee, watching Hannah color pictures or do homework, her laughter echoing around them like music. They became unofficial guardians, these tough men with soft hearts, making sure that Carla never felt alone, never felt afraid. Mason became a fixture in their lives, not a father figure exactly, but something else, a protector, a friend, someone who'd proven through actions that he could be trusted when it mattered most. Months later, when spring had finally returned and the last of winter's frost was gone, when the world was green and new again, Hannah drew a picture in crayon. It showed a row of motorcycles, each one carefully detailed with wheels and handlebars. A little girl in a red dress stood in front of them, her mouth open, calling for help. And a man was kneeling down, reaching out to her, ready to help. She gave it to Mason one Sunday morning, running up to him outside the diner with the pride only a child can have in their artwork. "This is us," she said proudly, pointing at each figure. "That's you and that's me, and that's when you saved my mama." Mason looked at the drawing for a long moment, his calloused fingers holding it carefully, as if it were made of glass instead of cheap paper and wax crayons. Something in his chest tightened, an emotion he didn't have words for. He folded it carefully, precisely, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his vest, right over his heart. "That's going with me wherever I ride," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been tears if he'd let them fall. And it did. That picture rode with him across thousands of miles through rain and sun and wind. A reminder that redemption isn't something you find. It's something you earn, one decision at a time, one moment of choosing right over easy, one cry for help that you don't ignore. Because sometimes the toughest hearts hide the deepest kindness. Sometimes the people society has written off are the ones who show up when everyone else walks away. And sometimes on a quiet morning at a roadside diner, a little girl in a red dress teaches a group of hardened bikers what it really means to be human.